Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the first for the year 2018. Great to see y'all. Happy New Year. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host of the Libertarian Angle, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you and all our viewers and listeners. It's wonderful to be back for another year. Not necessarily of another year of the Trump administration or crazy loonies on the left, but certainly glad to be back with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, it's going to be a good year for liberty, I have a hunch. And as a special treat to all of our viewers out there, we're joined by a special guest, good friend of both Richard and mine, James Bovard, who's been a policy advisor for the Future of Freedom Foundation, gosh, for more than 25 years, Jim. Great to see you, and Happy New Year to you.
Hey, thanks, Bumper. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Richard. I appreciate you all having me on. I'm glad you guys are both keeping up the fight, and I hope you're right about this being a good year for liberty and certainly be a novelty.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be a lot to write on, as there always is. But Jim, you know, you've been writing for us for, gosh, so long now. You write a monthly article in our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, and you have for some 25 years. It's a real honor to have you on. We just published a brand new ebook, our newest ebook by you, called Freedom Frauds, Hard Lessons in American Liberty, that's doing fantastic in terms of sales. They reach #1 in political theory or some subcategory there on Amazon. And
some category. Whatever. #1 sounds good. What the hell? It doesn't matter what the category is.
Number one is good regardless, whatever the category is. But
yeah, there was a comment I made on Twitter. I said it was ranked #6 in books whose titles were effed alliterative. So,
well, it's an awesome book, Freedom Frauds. And Jim, you know, you've done such great work over the years, and you're on the board, I think it's called the Board of Contributors at the USA Today, and lately you've done some fantastic work on a publication called The Hill. And one of the things that's always amazed me, Jim, is how you're able to provoke people, both on the left and the right. And I always enjoy you posting all the comments. You get attacked by the left, you get attacked on the right. You seem to enjoy it immensely.
I'm weird. So, no, I mean, it's, you know, I've always tried to take energy from the reactions that my articles provoke. And it's been interesting, especially some of the articles for The Hill, because there was one piece that got generated over 3,000 comments, most of them hostile. And it made for a fun blog post with screenshots of the angry, you know, of the rage. And I was simply, you know, I've simply tried to point out that, okay, Trump's doing a lot of bad things. Liberals have got a lot of ideas that make things even worse in many areas. And it's strange, it's puzzling to me that liberals look at Trump and say, well, the answer is to have a different president who has more power. Something that Trump should illustrate is that presidents per se have too much power. Nobody should be trusted with all this power. Not even somebody from New York.
Richard?
Well, you know, some of our viewers and listeners may not have had a chance yet to peruse your new book. And I was wondering if you could just take a minute or two and tell them what do you consider the main thrusts or focus of most of the chapters in the volume.
Thanks for the question. You know, there are several different sections in the book. The first section is memoir-type essays. The first, as I was saying on the first chapter is my Anti-War Awakening from a bus trip I did in 1975. I was hitchhiking up to New England. The hitchhiking didn't go so well, so I bailed out and took a Trailways bus and ended up being in the Baltimore bus station. I don't know how many people hung out in the Baltimore bus station in the 1970s, but you know, it was not an upper crust environment, which was fine because I wasn't upper crust. But I was hanging out there, and this guy comes up, sits down next to me, starts asking me what I was doing, and he and I end up, riding together to New York, and heard his life story. He was a Vietnam vet, an alcoholic. He was going to a VA hospital, I think in Albany, and he was telling me the story of how his life turned to crap. He said that he'd been in the Army for his entire career, and then he's in Vietnam, and there was a young Vietnamese girl, maybe 10 years old, and he was looking at her, and he thought she might have a grenade hidden behind her. So he gunned her down. It turned out she didn't. And he talked about how he was so tormented by that and how basically, wrecked his life. At least that was his story. And it gave me a feel for what our foreign wars do to the people who survive. And there's, if you look at what's happened to the troops who've come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, there have been so many guys and women with trouble with PTSD or other injuries. And this is what happens when politicians put American troops in what's called atrocity-producing situations, because the troops are being put in these areas where you really can't tell who's the enemy. I mean, it's not like World War II where where there's a battle line and the Wehrmacht, the German soldiers are on that side and we're on this side. No, you send them into these villages in Iraq, and they don't know who's friend and foe, and so there are a lot of innocent people that were killed. And it's horrible for the U.S. to be killing innocent people. That's generated a lot of additional terrorism, but it's also done a lot of permanent harm to American soldiers. There's another story in that section about how I learned how not to shovel. During my high school years, I spent one summer working for the Virginia Highway Department, and it was fascinating to see how the government workers would dodge work. And there was a certain way to lean on the shovel. It was important not to have both hands in your pocket at the same time. And it was fun to talk to the guys there because they had made an art of saving labor. And that was something which shaped one of the things I wrote about early on after I got to D.C. was government job training programs. And the whole idea that the government's going to teach people how to work, that's a paradox.
Yeah,
Jacob, if I could just do a follow-up on that.
Sure.
Libertarians and conservatives often find, at least initially in conversations, much common ground. We believe in individual freedom. We both say we believe in private property. We both use the rhetoric of the free market, though we don't always mean the same thing by that. But on foreign policy issues, I could imagine a conservative responding to what you just said about that gentleman that you ran into in the following way. War is a terrible tragedy, Jim. Innocent people get killed. Many innocent people got killed in previous wars that America has participated in, even when, to one degree or another, in the particular battle instances, American military personnel and their officers had wished or tried to not kill innocent people who got in the way. But war is hell, and sometimes war have to be fought, and there are enemies that potentially could threaten us. So all that is very well, Jim, but America has to be on the parapets around the world to preserve liberty. There are costs and benefits, and those innocent people and the burden they may carry with them after a war is unfortunately one of those costs. But doesn't America need to have its place in the world, even if these costs must sometimes be paid?
Well,
how do you respond to that?
Okay. It's fascinating to me to look at the history of the American wars over the last half century. And it's interesting, there's a new movie out called The Post with Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks, I guess, and others, glorifying the role of the Washington Post in publishing the Pentagon Papers. Now, folks are talking about how wonderful it was the media did this, and it was the New York Times that took the lead and the big risk, but the Post is getting the credit. Typical Hollywood BS. But what people aren't looking at is the lessons of the Pentagon Papers, and that is that the government, that the politicians don't learn from their mistakes, that they will go to great lengths to cover up their lies and government blunders, and then, like, for instance, with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, there were severe doubts, even on the first day, whether there had been a shootout with the North Vietnamese the second time around. But it was useful for McNamara and Lyndon Johnson. It helped his presidential campaign against Barry Goldwater. And next thing you know, we got 500,000 American troops there. And it never made any strategic sense. And it's fascinating to read the inside documents about how the government and how the top people in the Pentagon realized early on that the main purpose for the war was to make America look good. And it's frustrating that we've seen the similar deceits on the Iraq war. I mean, something I'd love to see is why in the hell did the U.S. get involved in Syria in 2012 and then change sides about a year or two later? Sort of change sides, but then we're supporting both sides. And it's interesting that there's very little intellectual curiosity on what the U.S. did in Syria, because I think that is perhaps as big, if not bigger, an outrage than what we did in Iraq. So what's your thoughts on that, Richard?
Well, I think I personally think there's several dimensions to this. One is the matter of the raw politics, like you say. Politicians, and certainly not just in the United States, use war and international conflicts as a way of distracting the citizenry from domestic issues to get them to rally around their respective flags and feel that their national existence or national honor is at stake, or there are threats around them, to basically maintain power, establish power, and to keep the people in line. And if they're willing to lie, cheat, cause the deaths of people, they seem to not have very many qualms. Then the other issue of it is, from my point of view, as a classical liberal or libertarian, is I ask, what is the legitimate role and function of government? It is to protect the life, liberty, and honestly acquired property of the respective citizens of that nation. Now, if you believe in limited government, then obviously you believe in some form of a national defense. But that national defense should be proportional and limited to actual threats to the immediate lives and territory of the United States and its citizens. There is no way to make the claim, just to use the post-war period as an example of this, there is no way to make the claim Korea, Vietnam, overthrowing what's his name in Panama and imprisoning him, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the black helicopter thing that happened in Somalia. There is no way to justify any of these interventions abroad on any reasonable argument that the territory of the United States or the lives or the property of American citizens were at threat or was facing an imminent threat to justify U.S. foreign interventions in this war. Therefore, it was illegitimate if one believes in certain roles under libertarian notions of the function of government. And you must always be suspicious and doubtful of giving discretion over these things to politicians and bureaucrats, because as public choice theory has taught us, they have their own self-interested motives and agendas that may have nothing to do with the liberty and the security of the American people.
Yeah, but it's important to stand up for American ideals, right?
The standing up of American ideals was expressed, as Jacob likes to often quote, by John Quincy Adams.
He was
America
good. Yes.
Does not go out and search for foreign dragons to slay. The best we could do is to serve as a practicing example of self-governing citizens and a self-governing peaceful country here in the United States that others will to emulate. And if Americans care about the conflicts and the controversies and the brutalities abroad, I consider that as private citizens and as private individuals, they are free to give their money to support such cause, and they are free to volunteer themselves to serve in such wars. But they should not drag the United States government and the rest of the citizens into them when it does not involve the reasonable, actual, or imminent threats that is understood as protection of rights rather than violating them.
Sounds good.
Jim,
Yeah.
one of the things that's always impressed me about you and why we've just really appreciated your work for the Future of Freedom Foundation, and I'm honored to have it, is because you understand and you write about, you address the twin threats that exist domestically from the federal government through the welfare state, the regulatory state, the FBI, things like Waco and Ruby Ridge that you took a leading role in addressing and exposing and opposing. And then the other twin threat of what we call the warfare state, the interventionisms abroad. And of course, that's reflected in this book, Freedom Frauds, that you've done for us. You know, I'm watching a series on Netflix called The Last Post. Fascinating story, historical account of the British occupation, the British Empire's occupation of Aden. And you've got these British troops that are there in Aden. I think it's like the 1950s, maybe early 60s, and they're running the country. This is part of the British Empire, and you've got people within Aden that are attacking and killing British troops. And so one of the troops says, "Why are they?" And the British are there bringing highways and manners and culture and everything to this backwater place. And one of the troops says to another troop, "Why are they killing us?" And the other person says, I can't figure it out. I have no idea why they're killing us." And from the viewer's perspective, I would assume that every viewer understands exactly why they're killing them. They want independence from the British Empire. They want to manage their own affairs, no matter how much good the British are bringing. They also bring their arrogance and their pomposity. And they just, the people that are there killing the troops just want them out of their country. And I think the television viewer can pick that up. But unfortunately, there's this moral blind spot when it comes to the U.S. because really, if you look around the world at all the troops all over the world, it's really a substitute for what was going on with the British Empire. You've got, the Iraq intervention, the regime change there, the Libya intervention, Afghanistan, and Africa now, Syria. Wherever you look, there is no one who is threatening to take away the freedom of the American people. Everything's happening over there. And yet there's this mindset, which is just a mindset of the lie, a denial of reality here at home, that the troops are protecting our freedom. Let us thank the troops for protecting our freedom. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nobody over there, whether it's Korea in the 50s, Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, Iraq, Iran, 53, the Mossadegh regime change operation, nobody is ever threatening to take away the freedom of the American people. In all of these problems that the United States has with respect to terrorism and out-of-control spending and the assaults on privacy, the NSA, is all rooted in this imperialist concept where the government, the federal government, is expected to maintain order in different parts of the world, much as the British Empire was doing. And ironically, in this movie, The Last Post, this series, when they refer to people that are killing the British troops, they call them terrorists. And of course, we see that around the world, that anybody that resists the U.S. domination, the national security state domination by the Pentagon or the CIA, they're called a terrorist. When in actuality, in most of the instances, they're just people that want the United States government to go home, just as many people wanted the British Empire to go home and the French Empire to go home, the Spanish Empire, and really empires throughout history.
Yeah, well, it's a good point. It's puzzling to me why people would not make that connection, especially in a place like Iraq, where the U.S. inflicted so much damage on civilians. And think back. It's interesting. Some of the media now is starting to put George W. Bush back on a pedestal and saying, well, he was very dignified compared to Donald Trump. But people have forgotten how just after Bush was reelected, Bush basically sent the U.S. forces in to punish the city of Fallujah. And you had a vast number of civilians there, many of whom did not get out. And the slaughter there was just appalling, and it was for no good reason. There was just anger that a number of U.S. contractors were brutally killed there, I think in April 2004, maybe late March 2004. But that somehow entitled George W. Bush to send the troops in there to just kind of totally pummel the city. And there are so many atrocities that never show up on the home front radar screen. It's interesting talking to liberals. Some liberals understand and make the connection, some of the points that you made as far as, okay, U.S. intervention abroad, yeah, it spawns terrorism. But there's a gullibility, and to see how liberals, to see how many of them responded to Obama. Well, yeah, I mean, it'd be bad if George W. Bush was bombing Libya, or if George W. Bush was bombing 7 different countries, as Obama was at the end of his presidency. However, Obama was the incarnation of good intentions, at least for many of the media, much of the media, and many people. And he was simply another politician who gave the order to kill people abroad, and that's going to ricochet on us.
So I think we can't discount, the cultural propaganda. We're all aware when there has been heavy direct government propaganda. We think of the Nazi propaganda machine spread among the German people, all the nonsense about a master race, or the hermetically sealed off environment that Stalin imposed on all the people in the Soviet Union so they only could hear what he and the regime wanted people to hear, and so on. But there's an implicit cultural propaganda machine in the United States as well. You can list the TV shows that reinforce this. There was an extremely popular show that must have ran for 6 or 7, maybe 8 seasons following 9/11 called Army Wives. This was about the home front at a military base in it's supposed to be in South Carolina, I think. Okay. But the troops, their husbands and their sons, have gone off to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq, and here's the home front and support and all the family problems. And then there's one running now, and that has for several years, called Madam Secretary. Now, this has a woman as the Secretary of State, and the image in every episode, I must be a masochist that I actually watch this, but it oozes with American good intentions. Our purpose is to spread freedom and help minimize abuse and harm around the world. And yes, we have interests, but transcending all of it is that America is this hope, and we must act to make the world better and freer and more like us. And anything that gets in the way shows mean-spiritedness by, especially as it's portrayed in the show, some people who are obviously those America First type conservatives. But of course, America First, they mean by isolationism, a disconnect from America's responsibility to the world. Now, nobody is forcing Hollywood to do this. And there certainly are anti-war movies. But watching week after week shows like that, or the ones portraying the FBI or the NCIS, is that it's an indoctrination that these government agencies are there to protect and secure, and they don't abuse our rights, or if something goes wrong, they feel guilty about it and wish they could set it right if only they could. Now, of course, they catch real bad guys like the FBI, serial killer, but the image is that they're there to serve us, and the hidden agenda of surveillance and intrusions of privacy and violation of civil liberties and America's adventurism abroad with all of the negative side effects that you were just expressing, Jim. This is just washed over to have the impression that America is good and we should be proud of the role we have in the world. And that cultural propaganda cannot be discounted, because I think it really works on the thinking of the population.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right, and it's I've read a number of stories about how the Pentagon and other agencies directly subsidize Hollywood to make some of these pro-government, pro-military blockbusters. It's hard for freedom to survive. It's hard for freedom to survive if people lose their bullshit radars. And that's happened a lot in this country. And to see what people will cheer or to see what people are no longer critical on. And it's not just a question of Obama or Trump or even George W. I mean, there are so many gullible people out there. It makes it very difficult for people to understand why government needs to be on a leash no matter who's president or no matter which federal agency is coming in with the, to save us. So very frustrating.
Yeah, I think the indoctrination thing is really an important issue in this. One of the best examples of what we're talking about, I think, right now is the Korea crisis. That the mainstream media loves to make fun of the citizenry in North Korea about how they seem to be little automatons who buy into everything the government's doing and nod their head and are ready to support the government and whatever its crises. What they fail to see is that the American people, by and large, with the exception of libertarians, are really in no different position. The mindset of the standard American and the mainstream media is no different toward the federal government than the mindset that North Koreans have toward their government. Now it's easy to look at the North Korean situation and saying, boy, look at those indoctrinated people. But over here, it's not quite so easy. I mean, we look at our fellow Americans and we say, look at the indoctrination. Whatever the national security establishment says, that North Korea is a threat, that something has to be done, that everybody just automatically buys into it. And when we libertarians say, now, wait a minute, maybe the U.S. is in the wrong here. Boy, the indoctrinee just goes nutso and says, oh my gosh, you're not a patriot, you're not an American because you're questioning what the CIA is saying, you're questioning what the Pentagon is saying. And I think what distinguishes us libertarians, one of the things is that we're able to look skeptically at what our own government is doing. We're able to put ourselves in the shoes of the so-called adversaries of the empire. I mean, if you look at the North Korean situation, sure, they do the same thing with their citizens that the government over here does. Oh, that we're under threat of an attack from the U.S. We need to rally around the flag. Everybody needs to band together. But they have some justification for it. I mean, here the U.S. intervenes in the Korean War, a war that was none of their business. It was just really a civil war. Now they say, oh, well, North Korea invaded South Korea. But at the same time, they seem to have no problem with Abraham Lincoln invading the southern part of the United States to reunite the country. And so here this guy invades the South to unite the country. What business of that was the United States government? I mean, they claimed, oh, the communists were coming to get us. North Koreans were never coming to get us. But Americans bought into this as much as the North Koreans buy into what their government are saying. And then the U.S. goes and carpet bombs villages all across the country. I mean, is it any wonder why these people are very, very leery of the U.S. government? It's been committed to regime change. This is what a lot of Americans will not acknowledge, that the U.S. is the real threat of an aggressor here. That it invaded Iraq with a regime change, Afghanistan with a regime change, it got regime change in Libya, and it's dedicated to regime change in Cuba. And the Cold War never ended for these people in the Pentagon and the CIA, and they're committed to regime change in North Korea. That's why they want nuclear weapons, because they know that's the only thing that's going to deter a U.S. invasion or an assassination or a coup is the threat of retaliation. But I think it's only when Americans start looking skeptically at whoever is in office, Jim, as you point out, we've got to put constraints on government regardless of who's elected, whether it's Obama, Bush, Trump, Hillary Clinton, or what have you, in order to stop these people from doing bad things to us. And I think we need to take it to a higher level and ask questions like, why are we a national security state? I mean, North Korea is a national security state. Why are we copying them? Why do we need a CIA? Why do we need a NSA? Is this reconcilable with the principles of a free society? And is the U.S. occupation or stationing of troops in Korea the real root of the problem here?
Yeah, well, to take a couple of steps back, I think you're right. Libertarians are more likely to understand some of the perils of foreign meddling, but it was a bright side of Donald Trump's campaign in 2016. It was sporadic, but Trump did talk about how a trigger-happy Hillary. He was talking about some of the other follies that we should not have, that we should not be in Syria, that we should not have stayed in Afghanistan. Trump did make a lot of good comments about the Iraq War. He kind of seesawed at first, but then came out a hell of a lot stronger against the war. It's interesting looking back at the GOP primaries in late 2015, early 2016. Trump had a lot of statements coming out and directly attacking the mindset of a lot of neoconservatives and other Republican candidates who were a lot more pro-war than the average American. And that was one of the bright spots of his campaign. Trump was promising to drain the swamp in Washington. He sure as heck hasn't done it. But just the fact that that kind of rhetoric helped win votes, I think shows there are a lot of Americans who are at least skeptical, if not downright cynical, about the federal power and about a lot of our interventions abroad. It's unfortunate Trump has generally failed to live up to his rhetoric, certainly on foreign policy. But it's interesting, almost like a tuning fork, to see how people responded to some of his rhetoric during the campaign, where he was far more outspoken on U.S. foreign critical of U.S. foreign interventions than any other major party candidate except for Ron Paul in the last few decades.
If I can make one other distinction that I think is useful, when they say they hate us over there, the fact is what they hate, as both of you have been pointing out, is American political and military intervention. The vast majority of the people in these other countries have nothing against American culture, American movies. Just today in the London Financial Times was a piece that leading representatives in the Iranian government are calling for the abolishment, the prohibition of learning English in schools in Iran. Now, why is this? Because English is the most popular language. Now, is every young Iranian a paid subversive agent for the U.S. government? Clearly not. But English is popular because it has become the language of international exchange of ideas, culture, science, entertainment. And they want to hermetically seal off Iran, or at least they've said they would like to prevent not just political comments by the U.S. government from getting through and people understanding them, but the cultural impact of what is a freer society like? What is it like when you can choose how you want to dress, who you want to associate with, what you want to read, what movie you'd like to see, how you can live without the government strangling you with a theological ideology or any totalitarian ideology that wants to straitjacket the people of a society. People want to interact often with Americans, enjoy what American culture has to offer, just like Americans absorb a lot of what other societies have to say and can offer in terms of music, food, clothing styles, fashion, movies, etc. It's governments that are the source of these problems, not leaving people alone to pick and choose and integrate and coordinate for cultural spreading of what each can learn from the other to improve their lives without inhibition, anger, hatred, or throwing a bomb.
Yeah. My experience has been the same as yours, Richard, that people basically love Americans. They love American tourists. They love American culture groups. They love American businessmen. It's really the government they really dislike. They hate because of all of the death and destruction that has been brought around the world, and the torture and the assassinations and the regime change operations. Jim, you were one of the few, I think, that went behind the Iron Curtain and traveled during the Cold War era that you detail in your book, Freedom Frauds. And I thought maybe you'd give us a little bit of insight into that and any bearings that you have with respect to relevance to today.
Well, it was during the mid-late 80s, I went behind the Iron Curtain half a dozen times, and I was trying to understand what economic absurdity and political tyranny meant in daily life. And so, and it was fascinating simply, there were different levels of tyranny. I mean, going to Hungary, going to Budapest, 86, 87, it was repressed. There was a sham of reforms. People were not very well fed, but people could speak up a little bit. But then taking the old Orient Express into Romania, there at the border, its life was completely different because, it it was almost like fear settled on the train at that moment, where it paused on a mountainside in Transylvania, where the border at that point was between Hungary and Romania. And you had the German shepherds that kept circling the train, and the military guards locked me into my train cabin by myself, and then searched it 4 times. And then going into the city of Bucharest and getting there very late and seeing people just looking malnourished and just anxious. I was told that it was considered a crime to talk to a foreigner, and people there would kind of see me. I was wearing an Australian style hat. It was Thanksgiving time. It was cold. So I was dressed, I looked like an American. People were like, who the hell is that? But it was interesting to see that the government had tried to change people's character. There was an old church, the remnants of an old church in downtown Bucharest. And the people would pass by it very nervously and cross themselves. I mean, it was like, and there was a look of fear in people's eyes as they looked at the church. And it was like, that was a novelty for me, because I'd never seen that kind of thing. And it was interesting because I knew I was, the government had informants everywhere. And in prior trips to other countries, I'd sometimes pulled out a notebook and written down notes in a notebook, and people had gotten very nervous of that. So I figured for this trip, what I'd do is make notes on the palm of my hand. And then later on, I'd sit down, look at a single word, and be like a fish hook. I could pull up a large number of memories and write out a sketch on that. So I was just, I was doing that throughout the visit time there in Bucharest. And I was finally got the hell out of the country, went to the airport, Bucharest airport, booked a flight to Frankfurt on Lufthansa. And there were all these different checkpoints at the airport, even worse than TSA. And at each one, I made sure I gave some packages of Kent cigarettes to the guards. That was a second currency, so you had to give them a bribe. And it was understood. Everybody did that. And the people that didn't got screwed by the guards. And so I was really happy. I made it past all the checkpoints. And then I was walking on the tarmac to the plane. I saw the gangplank, and there was just this one fat guard left, and he was just kind of standing with a submachine gun on his belly. And I held up my passport, my American passport, and my ticket, and he just waved me on. I said, great. And then I was almost going up the gangplank. And then he shouts, halt. And the guy comes running over, and he's got his submachine gun bouncing on his big old belly, grabs me by the shoulder, turns my hand over, and points at my palm and says, what is that? And I looked at my palm. I looked at him. I said, it's ink. He said, oh, okay, go ahead. But so I was really happy when the plane left Romanian airspace. So it's like, okay, because I had gone there as a tourist on a tourist visa. I was working as a journalist. I did a piece a few weeks later for New York Times on the theme was how East Europe had become the new third world. And this was the time when some of the economists were still saying, well, they're starting to turn around. They're making progress. So the Hungarian model, the mixed economy, this is something which Richard recalls vividly, because that was a kind of claptrap that was fashionable, certainly in Washington, New Republic, places like that. But so it was, going behind there and seeing the fear. And it was interesting to see after 9/11, this country, there were a lot of people, okay, it was never nearly anywhere as bad as it was in Bucharest, but there was a level of paranoia, of dissent. There were folks who I'd been friendly with, and all of a sudden, because I did not shift to the other side of the barricades after 9/11, I did not say that the federal government is going to save us. I was saying the same thing after 9/11 that I said before, and in some places that made me a bit of a pariah. But I'm sure the same happened to both you guys.
Well, I should mention I was traveling to the former Soviet Union quite frequently in 90 and 91. And every time that the plane I was on left Soviet airspace, the pilot of the plane would come on the intercom system and say, we have now left the Soviet Union. Everyone on the plane, including Soviet citizens, applauded loudly. Wow. It's sort of like we're out of the Twilight Zone.
That's the same way, but to be honest, that's the same way I always felt back when I lived in Boston. I felt that way when I left Massachusetts.
Jim, in the few minutes we have left, you've done just yeoman's work with respect to the abuses and really tyranny that the FBI has inflicted on the American people, and specifically Ruby Ridge, what happened there, and at Waco with the Branch Davidians. And you were one of the journalists who was just fearless during the time that was taking place, showing how wrong it was, and showing how the government was lying. And you've recently done a really fantastic update on Waco and Ruby Ridge for the Future of Freedom Foundation for our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. Why don't you talk a little bit about the FBI and the insights that you have with respect to that agency today?
Well, it's fascinating to see how the FBI has been put back on the pedestal, at least by the liberal media, over the last 6 or 8 months. And it's interesting. It's almost like a cultural barometer. If you look at the sentiment in the editorial pages in 2016, there was a period where conservatives loved the FBI because they thought it was going to bring down Hillary, and then the Hillary folks thought the FBI had screwed them really bad. And then after the election, the FBI is supposed to prove that Trump's victory was a Russian plot. And it's been fascinating to see the change in the cheering, but there's a long history with this agency, and it has far too much power. There are 4,000 federal criminal laws, and the FBI can pick and choose which ones it wants to inflict. The FBI has a long history of entrapment abuses. There are some decent FBI agents. There are some ones that try to uphold the law and be honest. And there have been some FBI operations that have been, helped, that have caught really dangerous bad guys. But there are a lot of others where the agency's gone for the headlines, and there's a lot of claptrap behind the cases. I mean, a single example, there was a piece a few weeks ago that the FBI guy, I guess, in charge of the investigation of the sniper in Las Vegas who fired over 1,000 rounds at the people at a concert. The FBI guy says, well, it's probably going to be next to October until we can say what the motives were. I mean, what is this crap? And why would people put up with that crap? I mean, we have one of the biggest mass killings in American history, and it's like, well, wait 10 more months and we'll tell you what we know. I mean, people would not tolerate that with a school shooter. If the local police said, well, we're going to wait till after the election, or we're going to wait till a couple of years and then tell you what really happened. I mean, there's a reason people were skeptical of the FBI. But it's interesting to see the groveling instinct by a fair number of people in the media and some Americans about how they, they're just hell-bent on putting the halo over the agency. And it's like, it's a very expensive halo.
Richard?
I would just concur. One has to realize that government does have legitimate functions in a free society, and among them is to protect people's life and property. And there are local policemen, the vast majority of them, who go about their business of patrolling the streets and trying to dissuade crimes by their presence, as well as to bring suspected criminals to justice. And the fact is that one can debate about whether there should have been a national police agency such as the FBI or not initially, but they do work in capturing serial killers across state boundaries or kidnappers and stuff. And many of those agents, as Jim was saying, I'm sure act honorably, and they try to do so within the law. But the fact is that these agencies have also another agenda or use for those in political power. The desire of those in the bureaucracy itself to get a name for themselves, to have a chance for promotion, headlining, moving on to a higher position, even a politically elected office, or those in politics who want to use those agencies for their own political agendas. And it is that misuse and abuse and the centralized power of it that is so detrimental to the preservation of many of our everyday civil liberties. That has nothing to do with what would be legitimate policing and investigative work, which obviously is necessary in a free society because there are bad guys. And if you believe in limited government, there has to be someone responsible for investigation and apprehension.
Well, I think the original concept of where the states should handle criminal justice was the right one. Yeah. Sure, government exists to punish the murderers and the rapists and the thieves, the kidnappers, but all this could be done at the state and local level with cooperation between state governments across state lines. In a theoretical sense, one might argue that the FBI does this, but on balance, when you look at their history, the fact that they even have their building in Washington named after Hoover, to me is a total disgrace. That here's a guy that used blackmail and extortion and kept secret files on people for the purpose of blackmailing them. COINTELPRO, and then also the blackmailing of Martin Luther King, trying to get him to commit suicide. And then Waco and Ruby Ridge. On balance, I think this thing's been an absolute disaster, and it really is like an American Gestapo on balance, which is exactly what people said at the beginning, that this has no place in a free society. And so it's not a coincidence that the American people did not have a national federal police force for more than 100 years of American history.
Well, yeah, but the flip side is it's important to have a federal agency come in and issue press releases after there's been a big crime locally. So, and going back to your Gestapo comment, President Harry Truman in 1945 wrote in his diary that he was fearful that the FBI was becoming a Gestapo. And this is right after the end of World War II in Europe. And, you know, that term had a very intense meaning for Americans because they had seen what the secret police had done in Nazi Germany.
Right.
Yeah, well, on that note, we'll wrap it up. Jim, it's been a real pleasure to kick off the new year with you. You've got this great book called Freedom Frauds, which I highly recommend everybody to buy. It's on Amazon. It's on our website at fff.org. You can catch Jim's articles every month at the Future of Freedom Foundation by subscribing to FFF Daily or to our monthly journal, The Future of Freedom. We also link to all the articles that he writes in other publications, especially USA Today, The Hill, where he continues to create all kinds of controversy from both the left and the right. And Richard, it was great to kick off the new year with you, and look forward to working with you this year.
Absolutely. Bye-bye to our viewers and listeners.
Hey, thanks for your kind words, both you guys. It's great to be on with both of you.
All right, that's it, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks for tuning in. Again, to get more information about the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org.